you've got to be making your own slip. So all the little schmutz, all the little pieces that you kind of clean up every day, if you don't have that, you could break little pieces of clay and then put it in your container. Let them dry out. They need to be bone dry. It's bone dry if it looks like really white compared to like the clay that's like dark. So you really want to wait until it gets to bone dry before you add the water. So hopefully you have a container, you've been collecting little bone dry pieces. Once they get to bone dry, you're gonna add enough water, just enough to cover it, and then let it sit overnight. It does what we call slake down, and it'll kind of dissolve. If you're putting wet clay in there in pieces, it never fully dissolves. It's always kind of like chunky. So if you're at home, you need to make your own slip. After it slakes down for a day, you can check it the next day, and you should be able to mix it up. You can use like a wooden thumb tool and just really try to mix it up. You only want enough water to cover it. You don't want any extra water in there. It's just plain water, but you're gonna need the slip for this particular project. So you wanna make sure that you've got that taken care of. When you put the stuff in there, if you want it to air out, don't put the lid in it. But once you make the slip, make sure you're kind of keeping it covered so you have it. If you're in the room and you need slip, there's an orange bucket and a blue bucket under the table there that's got the slip in it. Okay, so the first step, no matter what you do, you gotta make sure that you're wedging the clay. If you have not added any water to your clay at all, we've been digging in it for a couple weeks, I gotta make sure that you spray a little bit of water in there. So make sure every once in a while you kind of add a little bit of water just to keep your clay moist. I like to kind of twist mine and then put it upside down onto the twist to make sure that it's really sealed. All right, you're gonna start by wedging the clay. Make sure whatever you do, you always start wedging. You really wanna be wedging on like a t-shirt or a piece of fabric or a pair of jeans. If it starts to feel dry, you can always add a little bit of water to it. Just make sure that you wedge it continuously until it's not sticky or tacky anymore. Wedge it one direction. Make sure you're always pushing down and forward, and then you're gonna switch it and wedge the other direction. Make sure anytime you restart a project that you are wedging the clay. If you start making the coil and it doesn't work out, you gotta go back and wedge it. So it might be a lot of wedging. Make sure you're always pushing down and forward. You really should have this kind of bowl shape that's forming. Notice the clay is together. It's not like flattened out like a pancake. To make a coil or to wedge, you're not making slabs. If you make a slab, you're actually in more danger of getting air pockets in it when you fold it back on top of itself. Once you get a good wedge, now it's time to make a coil. So you're gonna take part of this. Again, you don't want to flatten it out. You want it to kind of be together from where you wedged it. I like to kind of start forming mine a little bit first. All right, so I like to make it kind of start to form it. You want to make sure that you're not trapping air in it. That's why it's important that you don't have a slab and then you're like folding it over to have air in it. The coil's a skill. It might take you a couple times to kind of get it. That's okay. I'll make it look a lot easier than it's going to be for you guys just because I'm pretty good at it. A lot of you won't like coils. I really end up liking coils. I like to build whole projects with coils. What you're trying to do is to make like a long snake about the size of your finger. It does take some pressure. You want to roll all the way through it. Make sure you're doing long rolls. You don't want little short rolls. If you're just doing little short rolls, your coil will flatten out. You don't want it to be flat. You want it to be round. It's important that there's no air in it. If you start to notice any kind of weird lines, right when you notice it, try to fix it with your thumb. If you notice any little hard pieces, any little bone dry clay schmutz, make sure you're picking that out. If your clay does kind of flatten out a little bit, where it's kind of like an oval shape, like a rectangle, bang it on the table a little bit so you can get it back to a square. Then give it a lot of extra pressure and you should be able to get it back into like a rounded coil. We are going to be putting this on a foot on the bottom of our project. You're always kind of working the clay from the inside outward. You're kind of like pulling it. And you really want to make sure you're like rolling through it all the way. You want to end up with a coil that's about as thick as your finger. We are going to lose a little bit when we blend it in, so you want it to be about this size. You don't want it to get really small, and you don't want it to be thicker than your finger ever. All right, for your project, where do you put the foot on the bottom? So you gotta kind of like look at your bottom. You want it to move in just a little bit. I like to draw it out with my needle tool so I can kind of figure out exactly where this is gonna go. Okay, next you have to do scoring. So no matter what you're attaching, if you're attaching two pieces of clay together, you have to do what's called slip and scoring. This is your slip. The needle tool is going to get you the scoring. You really want to rough up the surface a lot. You don't want to go super deep, but you do need to really rough up the surface. I usually go on an angle. I go one direction, and then I go the other way. You're making a place for the slip to go in. You want to be careful that you're not cutting all the way through. You're just kind of doing it on the surface like we do with the textures. But really rough it up, like right where the coil is going to go. That's called scoring. You're going to do the same thing to your coil. We're going to end up putting the coil on the foot, so you want to make sure that you're roughing up the surface of the coil as well. Only on the one side. I tend to do diagonal cuts all the way down, and then I go back and I cross those cuts. Your goal here is to just scratch up the surface with your scoring so that you can attach two pieces of clay. So anytime you have to attach two things, you have to go through this process where you're scoring it and the rest of it is not scored, but this is scored, and then you're going to add slip. So to slip, you can use your finger or you can use one of the tools. You really want to get a lot of slip on there. It's okay if there's too much and it's like oozy, but you really want to get it in there. You don't want it just to be water on the surface. You really want to push the clay into all those little scoring cracks that you made. You don't want an air pocket, so it's really important that you really get the clay in there until you can't see the cracks. You're going to do the same thing with your project. Really get a lot of slip in there. This is going to be like the glue that's holding the pieces together. So you always want to make sure that you're scoring and slipping both sides. It's okay if it oozes out a little bit. We can always wipe it off, but it's important to get it on there. Okay. So I've got this scored and slipped. I've got this scored and slipped. Now we're going to put the slip to slip, the score to score, and you're going to line it up. And you're going to cut off any extra. Don't forget to score and slip where it's going to join. Okay, and then you want to get it on there and like push it and wiggle it a little bit. I like to do the coil like as I'm going because sometimes the clay stretches. Some people like to measure it and make the ring first. I don't like to do it that way. All right, next step, you've got this on, but you need to blend it in. So you're going to take your wooden thumb tool. One of the sides is like a curved side. You're going to use that curved side to blend it on. You're going to go around the whole outside and blend it on, and you're going to do the same thing on the inside. It's okay if it's a little bit messy. In ceramics, we always do construction first, and then we go back and worry about the aesthetics, the beauty of it. You just got to make sure that your construction's good. There should be enough slip where it's kind of like oozing out so that you don't end up with air pockets. Go around the entire outside, and then you're going to do the same thing on the inside. Then you can kind kind of either take your tool or a sponge and kind of go around and clean it up. This inside part is where you're going to end up putting your name. So you want to make sure that you put your name and the class period that you're in, the AB number. Put your first initial and then your last name. And then your number. So make sure that's in the bottom. The next step is you want to take some kind of board. If you're in the classroom, they're in the tall cabinets in the corner by the glazed test tiles. If you're at home, you could use a textbook or something. The whole time you're working on this, from that first day on, it's going to be upside down. But we do, when we're eventually going to flip it over, this is the bottom. So we want to make sure that it's level. So you can use a board or a textbook. You just want to kind of like bang it on there a couple times to make sure that it's level and flat. So it's not going to be like wonky and wiggly. So make sure that you take a minute, level that out. If you didn't have time last time, you want to make sure you're going around the lip, the edge that's here, and wiping it. We are going to start decorating the outside with texture and the lip with texture, so it's important that it's smooth. If you already did that last time, you don't need to redo it today, but you do want to make sure that everything's really smooth before you start putting the texture on there. Today you don't want to add a lot of water. If you're adding a ton of water to your project, it really causes problems for when you're trying to do the texture, so only do it if you have not done it already. So you'll be able to add texture to the outside, texture to the lip. Really pay attention to any of your cuts when you're going around. If you accidentally had like a pointy cut going in instead of something that's round, take your needle tool and really round it out like the inside of your fingers. Make sure that the area is really round. If you have like a V that's sharp that's coming in, it will start to pull. I saw some this morning, so really make sure that you're rounding out anything. You can also, if you don't want to use a sponge, use one of your rib tools to kind of smooth the outside. Just be really careful. You don't want to like push really hard on this, because you don't want it to punch through like a cookie cutter. If your slab is still like really crazy stiff, like it just wants to be a slab and it's not quite laying down, make sure that you're wetting your sponge and kind of like softly getting the sides to lay down. If you're working on that, you won't be able to get to the texture today. We'll continue working on this next time. We'll do the texture on the outside and on the lip. Does anybody have questions?